Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today we're going to be analyzing the Florida 2018 Senate race. So, as most of you know, Rick Scott is the current incumbent governor of Florida, and he's going to be running against Bill Nelson, the incumbent senator from Florida, who's been in there for 3 terms. So I think that this race is probably the most competitive. Maybe Indiana's more competitive, but I think this is probably one of the most competitive races in the 2018 Senate election, and this is because Bill Nelson is a very highly approved of senator, and Rick Scott is a very highly approved of governor. And Bill Nelson in the past has done very well in Florida elections. He's won in landslides in past elections. He's done very well, especially as a Democrat in Florida. But Rick Scott, many people think, could end that winning streak for him. I mean, he's probably the only candidate I think that Bill Nelson could lose to. And I think that currently Rick Scott has a fighting chance against him, and I'm going to analyze that throughout this video. So as we can see by the polling here, Rick Scott has a very narrow lead above Bill Nelson according to the RCP polling. And I think this is a pretty fair reflection. I mean, one big factor as well is I think the lack of minority appeal. Bill Nelson doesn't really have a lot of minority appeal since he's an elderly white male. He doesn't have a lot of Hispanic appeal, which I think is necessary in order to win in this state. And Rick Scott obviously has even less being a white male Republican. But I think that that's going to be a big factor, especially for Bill Nelson. Another big factor in this race is the issue of gun legislation. Because although Rick Scott did pass legislation to try to right the wrong of the whole shooting that occurred a few months ago, Bill Nelson and others are making it a part of their campaign that Rick Scott didn't do enough, which is easy to say since he's a Republican, and the NRA is definitely going to be a big factor in this election on how Rick Scott is getting funding from the NRA and considering everything that occurred. That's going to be a main talking point for Bill Nelson, I feel like. But let's look at the Trump approval in this state, because that's going to be a big factor as well, obviously, as it is in every single Senate race. So this is the current approval and disapproval. His approval is 51%. So for a state like Florida, that's very good. That's a very good approval to have in a state like Florida, which surprised a lot of people. You think it would be lower since it's lower in the rest of the states, pretty much. And his disapproval is at 45%. That's good as well. That's a net approval of positive 6%. So that's good for Trump. So if you're a Republican in this state, you could align with Trump a little bit and don't have to be so paranoid about whether or not you're too friendly or not too friendly to him, like you should be in Arizona if you're running for the senator or governor's race, which I discussed in my Arizona analysis video. And now if we're looking at the Senate approval for Bill Nelson, his current approval is 47% with a disapproval of 29%. Which is higher than his counterpart Marco Rubio, which is interesting considering that Marco Rubio is Hispanic and Bill Nelson is not. But keep in mind that there is a large elderly population in Florida, which is why Bill Nelson probably does have very good appeals, because he could appeal to the elderly population. But then again, so can Rick Scott, so that kind of negates itself when you're considering these two candidates, which is another reason why it's going to be pretty competitive. But his approval is good, but Rick Scott's is even better. As you can see, 58% approval, 31% disapproval, and 11% undecided, which is a very low amount of people who are undecided when it comes to approval ratings for politicians. So Rick Scott is definitely has approval above Bill Nelson, I think, overall, which is a big advantage on his part. Same with the Trump advantage, but the thing about Rick Scott is he's playing he's obviously not a Trump Republican. He's obviously down the middle when it comes to that. But he's embracing Trump just enough. Like Trump has come and spoken at his rallies. He's come and endorsed him, and I think that's good for Rick Scott in a state that has a higher than average approval for a flip state for Donald Trump. So that's a good thing for Rick Scott. And now if we're looking at the election in 2012, which I discussed before, Bill Nelson, just looking at this map, it's extraordinary. Bill Nelson won by 13%. That's a very, very large margin when it comes to Florida, especially, as most of you know. And fundraising we should take a look at as well, because fundraising in this race, especially when you're campaigning with someone like Rick Scott, who is very wealthy, is going to be a big factor. As we can see, I guess primary factors aren't really that big. But if we're looking at fundraising, Bill Nelson outraised his competitor in 2012, Connie Mack, by very large margins. Very large margins. He definitely had that above his competitor, which I think was a big factor in his victory, in his very large victory in 2012. But that's not so much the factor when it comes to Rick Scott, since Rick Scott has a lot more money than Bill Nelson. But if we're looking at Rick Scott's race for the governorship in 2014, he won narrowly. That's one advantage that goes to Bill Nelson. Bill Nelson does much better in elections than Rick Scott, but Rick Scott has much more money. He won by 1%, and if we're looking at fundraising, may not be on this page. If it is, then I'll comment on it. Obviously, we should also look at approval here. The polls overwhelmingly favored Charlie Crist, who was going against Rick Scott, but Rick Scott still did win. So that should tell you something about the current election that we're going into. I don't see any. Yeah, it was all toss-up, and then Sabato's crystal ball listed as lean Democratic for the 2014 election, so that's a big factor. Oh, I was looking at the wrong polling. My mistake, jeez. Okay, this is the right polling. It wasn't overwhelmingly in his column, but it looks like there were a lot more polls favoring the Democrat, but regardless. And now if we're looking at the 2016 election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump did win this state, obviously. He won it by a very small percentage. And if we're comparing this to the margins that we saw in the 2014 election, which was the most recent statewide election in Florida, they're very similar. I think that Donald Trump did better than Rick Scott did in this state, which is another reason why I think Donald Trump's endorsement and approval and support of Rick Scott's going to go a long way. Then if we're looking at the current election polling on the Wikipedia page, might as well look at endorsements. Bill Nelson has gotten a lot of endorsements. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, some high-profile Democrats, a lot of organizations. Rick Scott has gotten the endorsements from Donald Trump, not from the vice president, not from Mike Pence, though, which is surprising. But as you can see, there are a lot of high-profile Republican senators. There are a lot of local, high-profile Florida representatives. He probably has endorsements over Bill Nelson. But if we're looking at, it's pure toss-ups, as you can see here, by most of the major polling stations. And if we're looking at polls, it's very similar to how it was with Rick Scott and his governor race back in 2014. It's split evenly, but polls still show a slight favor towards Rick Scott. Okay, so now if we're looking at Ballotpedia, which I think is a more telltale sign of fundraising. Yeah, if we're looking at it here, he spent $75 million to win the governor's house in 2010, and Rick Scott has a net worth of about $150 million, and donors apparently say that he's raised $110 million to campaign against Bill Nelson, a very ridiculous number. Okay, so now if we're looking at polls as well, they're much more in Rick Scott's favor. I'm trying to get to fundraising, toss-ups, as you can see, pure toss-ups. And once we're down to campaign finance, there currently isn't any data available for Rick Scott's fundraising, which is kind of unfortunate. But if we're looking at Bill Nelson's fundraising, $11 million receipts and $10 million cash on hand. And then if we're looking at just some small reports from Rick Scott's campaigning, $110 million. I don't think that's in receipts or in personal wealth, but that's still overwhelmingly more than Bill Nelson when it comes to fundraising. And then there is a number of different things that Bill Nelson that Rick Scott can campaign against Bill Nelson on, and I think that and here's a more accurate depiction of Rick Scott's fundraising, $10.7 million in 3 months, and that's that number itself is less than the amount that Bill Nelson has raised, but that's just in 3 months. So I think that Rick Scott definitely has fundraising above Bill Nelson. It's kind of hard to say at this point since there's no solid numbers available, but as you can see here, $149 million last year was his net worth. So fundraising definitely in Rick Scott's favor. And as I said before, this Senate race is going to be primarily about guns. And I think that as a governor, Rick Scott has done a good job at passing decent gun legislation that doesn't alienate his Republican base, while at the same time doesn't bring too much outcry from Democrats looking for more gun legislation. But still, Bill Nelson's going to use that against him. He's going to use the NRA against him. So yeah, that's going to be a big factor in this senator's race, and I think we're starting to already see that it is. And Bill Nelson's comments on replacement for Anthony Kennedy. He said that he would not support a candidate that would overturn Roe v. Wade. Rick Scott's using that against him, saying that he's just putting the Democratic Party first before Florida. So I think that Bill Nelson overall is in a very precarious situation. I mean, you don't have to be an expert to know that. Although Bill Nelson has done very well in past elections, this is his biggest challenge yet, and I think that I would give this election a tilt red in Rick Scott's column, which is remarkable considering that this state is trending blue overall, yet I think that Rick Scott's approval as governor, his statewide approval, and his overall approval, the overall lack of Hispanic appeal on Bill Nelson's part. And one big factor as well is that Bill Nelson doesn't really have good appeal amongst progressives, which he could really use in an election like this when the progressive movement is very strong in Florida. But regardless, I'd give this a tilt in Rick Scott's column. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This is my third analysis video. I hope to do more like this as the Senate race and the midterms get closer. I hope to do a House of Representatives video, maybe analyzing that as well. If you guys would like that, please let me know down below. If you guys would like to see any videos in particular, please let me know down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.